Imagine a king draped in gold, his throne glittering in the light of burning torches, while outside his palace walls, families are torn apart, sold, and shackled. History remembers his wealth, his armies, his palaces, but what it rarely tells is the price paid by his own people. In the shadows of power, betrayal often came not from distant invaders, but from those crowned to protect their kingdoms. This is the untold story of African kings who, for the promise of gold and fleeting power, betrayed their own blood. They struck deals with foreign traders, sending captives into ships bound for slavery while their coffers filled with riches. Yet among this darkness, voices of righteousness rose. Chiefs who refused to sell their neighbors, villages that fought back even when resistance seemed hopeless, and individuals who carried justice in their hearts long before the world would speak of abolition. Tonight, we uncover the forgotten history of kingdoms built on both glory and chains. We expose the hypocrisy, the greed, and the irony of rulers who preached honor while dealing in betrayal. But more importantly, we remember the righteous few, those who stood firm in truth, who chose justice over gold, and whose legacies deserve to be told. Because history is not only about the powerful who betrayed, it is also about the courageous who stood against them. Long before the sails of European ships cut across Atlantic waters, Africa was not a silent continent waiting to be discovered. It was a mosaic of kingdoms, empires, and communities, each with its own laws, traditions, and sources of wealth. Great cities thrived along trade routes that stretched from the savannas of West Africa to the shores of the Indian Ocean. Gold dust glittered in the markets of Timbuktu. Ivory carved its way into palaces. Salt, more precious than silver, was carried across deserts on camel caravans. Powerful rulers sat on thrones not merely as warlords, but as guardians of justice, culture, and the well-being of their people. The Ashanti, Dahomey, Oyo, Congo, and countless others had systems of governance that balanced kingship with councils, elders, and religious authority. These societies were not without conflict, yet they carried within them deep moral codes, oaths sworn by ancestors, rituals to honor truth, and an understanding that a ruler's first duty was to protect his people. And yet, into this vibrant world came the shadow of a new commerce. Foreign merchants first appeared on the horizon with goods that dazzled the eye, cloth dyed in impossible colors, guns that spat fire, liquor that clouded judgment, and above all, gold. To many kings, these strangers seemed like an opportunity, not a threat. They came bearing gifts, promising alliances, whispering of wealth without end. But behind their smiles was a hunger not for friendship, but for bodies. The stage was set. A clash was coming, not only between kingdoms and outsiders, but within Africa itself. For when the chains of slavery were offered as currency, rulers would be forced to decide, uphold their duty to protect or betray their people for the gleam of gold. For many African rulers, the arrival of European traders was not at first a story of chains. It was a story of opportunity. Gold had long been the measure of power, and kingdoms that controlled the mines or the routes to them commanded respect. When Portuguese ships anchored off the coast in the 15th century, they brought with them treasures that stirred both wonder and temptation. Imagine the scene. A king in Dahomey or along the Congo River examining a musket for the first time, a weapon that could shift the balance of war overnight. Imagine bolts of European cloth, finer than local weavers could craft, dazzling in sunlight. Or barrels of liquor, intoxicating both to the body and to the mind, passed as symbols of alliance. These goods spoke directly to ambition. For rulers facing rival states, guns meant security. For kings burdened by constant warfare, foreign gold promised stability. But this trade came at a price. At first, it was ivory, pepper, and gold that crossed the seas. Soon, the demand shifted. Foreign merchants wanted captives. They knew that kingdoms were constantly at war, that prisoners filled compounds after each battle, and that chiefs held the power to decide life or death over them. A grim question began to echo in royal courts. Why waste prisoners in execution or tribute when they could be sold for gold? This logic, seductive and corrosive, spread like fire through dry grass. Some rulers hesitated, fearing ancestral wrath for betraying their kin. Others convinced themselves that selling enemies was not a betrayal at all. It was strategy, a way to weaken rivals while filling treasuries. And slowly, morality bent beneath the weight of temptation. The lure of gold was never only about riches. It was about power, survival, and pride. Yet beneath the glitter of coins and muskets, seeds of betrayal had been planted, seeds that would grow into chains. History often tells us that slavery was a wound inflicted only from outside, but the truth is more complicated and far more tragic. The betrayal often began at home, within the very palaces sworn to protect. In the Kingdom of Congo, for instance, kings once sought alliances with Portugal to strengthen their rule. What began as a relationship of diplomacy and faith, sharing priests, trading goods, learning new technologies, soon slid into darker exchanges. Civil wars erupted, and rival claimants to the throne sold captives to Portuguese traders, not just enemies taken in battle, but subjects, neighbors, even kin. Gold and guns became the bargaining chips of legitimacy, while ordinary people paid with their freedom. Further west in Dahomey, monarchs built a terrifying machine of war that captured thousands. At first, they justified the trade as survival. Better to sell the prisoners of war than to waste them. But as demand grew, wars were fought not to defend, but to capture. The throne gleamed with gold and European muskets, while villages around it wept in silence. Even in Ashanti lands, where power was vast and wealth abundant, some rulers turned to slave trading as a way to outmaneuver rivals. Kings who were meant to be fathers of the nation became merchants of flesh. They prayed to ancestors for blessings while dispatching caravans of chained men, women, and children toward the coast. And yet, these betrayals were not without irony. Kings who imagined themselves stronger with European weapons often found their kingdoms hollowed from within. Armies grew mighty, but trust crumbled. What use is a throne draped in gold when the people no longer believe the crown protects them? These are not just stories of ambition. They are stories of irony, of hypocrisy exposed by history. Rulers spoke of honor, justice, and divine duty, but their actions betrayed the very soul of their kingdoms. The wealth they gained glittered only for a moment. The shame of betrayal has lasted centuries. Once the first deals were struck, slavery ceased to be an accident of war or a side effect of politics. It became a business. European traders, with their fortresses along the coasts and their ships waiting like vultures on the tide, transformed betrayal into an industry. The system was brutally efficient. Local rulers captured or delivered captives. Middlemen marched chained columns to the coast, their necks locked in wooden yokes. At trading posts, merchants examined human beings as if they were cattle. Teeth pried open, muscles squeezed, scars inspected for signs of rebellion. Guns, cloth, liquor, and trinkets were exchanged, and the captives vanished behind the walls of coastal forts, waiting for ships that would tear them from their homeland forever. European traders understood the weakness of kings. They played rivals against each other, fueling wars that produced a steady flow of captives. One chief was armed to fight his neighbor, and his neighbor was armed to retaliate. The price of peace was always more blood, more prisoners, more chains. Satire barely needs invention here. The hypocrisy was glaring. Kings who boasted of justice allowed their courts to auction human beings. European merchants who spoke of civilization conducted business with iron shackles in their hands. Both sides cloaked their greed in the language of necessity. "It is survival," said the kings. "It is commerce," said the traders. Truth called it what it was, betrayal. And yet, even as the machine grew, there were those who recoiled. Some chiefs refused to hand over captives, preferring exile or defiance to betrayal. Some communities fled inland, choosing hardship rather than chains. These voices were small against the roar of commerce, but they carried the first sparks of justice. For the slave trade was not only about gold changing hands, it was about humanity reduced to merchandise, about kingdoms reshaped by betrayal, about the terrible irony of thrones that stood taller while their people vanished into the horizon. Amid the thunder of muskets and the clinking of chains, not all bowed to greed. History, though often silent on their names, still carries whispers of the righteous, chiefs, warriors, and entire villages who chose justice over gold. Their resistance was costly, But their choices remind us that even in the darkest times, conscience could not be entirely extinguished. In Senegambia, some leaders refused to hand over captives even when threatened by better armed rivals. They declared that no neighbor, no kin should be sold like cattle. Their stand often brought retaliation, attacks, burnings, and betrayals by rival chiefs who were eager for European guns. Yet, their refusal carved a moral line in history. Further inland, communities fled the reach of the trade. Villages packed up and vanished into forests, choosing hunger and hardship rather than living under rulers who trafficked their children. Their defiance rarely made the chronicles of kings, but in the silence of oral tradition, they lived on as examples of courage. Even within great kingdoms, voices of conscience rose. In Congo, some nobles denounced the growing slave trade, warning that the kingdom's soul was being sold piece by piece. Their cries were ignored by rulers blinded by foreign gold, but their words now echo as prophecies fulfilled. Betrayal hollowed their kingdoms until nothing remained but fragments. These righteous few could not stop the tide. They could not dismantle the forts on the coast, nor disarm the ships waiting in the harbors. But they stood as living contradictions to the lie that slavery was inevitable. Their lives testified that choices always existed, to betray for gold or to uphold justice. And while kings and merchants are remembered for their palaces and profits, it is these unnamed guardians of conscience who preserved the possibility of dignity. They did not win in their time, but history remembers them with honor. If betrayal hollowed kingdoms from the throne down, resistance rose from the ground up. For every chain fastened, there were hands that struggled against it. For every betrayal written in gold, there were acts of defiance etched in blood and memory. Some resistance took the form of refusal. In the late 18th century, the rulers of Futa Toro in present-day Senegal drew a sharp line. No subjects of their land would be sold to Europeans. When French traders came demanding captives, they were told bluntly, "Here, we do not traffic in our people." This act of defiance cost them alliances and brought enemies, but it marked a rare moment when justice stood firm against profit. Elsewhere, resistance erupted in fire. In Dahomey, villages attacked royal armies sent to seize captives, burning their own settlements rather than surrender to chains. Some warriors chose death over capture, hurling themselves into rivers or cliffs when surrounded. Others turned their rage directly on the trade itself, raiding caravans of captives, storming slave forts, even killing European merchants when the opportunity arose. On the coast, escape became rebellion. Captives awaiting shipment sometimes broke free, sparking uprisings inside the dark dungeons of slave forts. Though most were suppressed with brutal violence, the mere act of revolt carried a message. Human dignity cannot be erased by commerce. Perhaps most powerful of all were the spiritual rebellions, prophets and leaders who framed slavery as an abomination against divine law. They warned kings that ancestral curses would fall on those who sold their people. Some inspired movements of resistance that spread like wildfire through oral traditions, igniting not only swords, but spirits. These rebellions rarely toppled thrones or dismantled the transatlantic trade, but they kept alive a crucial truth, that Africans were not passive victims nor silent commodities. They resisted again and again with weapons, with words, with faith, and with sacrifice. And through their defiance, they planted seeds of justice that would outlast the greed of kings and merchants alike. History, when examined closely, often writes its own satire. The kings who claimed divine right to protect their people became auctioneers of flesh. The Europeans who preached civilization conducted their lessons with chains and whips. It would be laughable if it were not so tragic. Picture the royal court of Dahomey, ceremonies filled with drums, priests invoking ancestors for blessings of justice, while outside the palace walls, caravans of chained captives waited to be sold. A king who prayed for protection of his people bartered those very people for muskets. Hypocrisy did not whisper in corners, it marched in daylight, dressed in gold. Or consider European merchants who wrote letters home about spreading the light of Christ while building forts with underground dungeons for men and women packed like crates. They lectured Africans about morality, yet their business model was measured in bodies per ship, survival rates per voyage, profit per captive. The irony could split stone. Satire also lives in the small contradictions. Kings who built statues to their greatness while their villages crumbled in depopulation. Merchants who toasted to liberty in Europe while profiting from chains in Africa. Rulers who claimed necessity for their treachery but never once sold their own children. To tell this story with irony is not to mock the suffering of the enslaved. Never. It is to strip bare the hollow masks of power, to show that betrayal cloaked itself in grand words, but was, at its core, cowardice and greed. Satire is justice spoken in laughter sharp enough to cut. History does not need our invention to sound absurd. It only needs us to hold up the mirror. And in that reflection, hypocrisy condemns itself. Gold glittered for a season. Chains endured for centuries. The betrayal of kings did not simply sell captives into foreign lands. It hollowed the very foundations of their own kingdoms. The first cost was people. Entire villages were emptied, families split, lineages broken, elders silenced, and youth stolen. A kingdom's wealth had always been measured not only in gold, but in its people. Farmers to till the land, soldiers to defend borders, artisans to craft beauty, storytellers to carry memory. By selling their people, rulers sold their future. The second cost was trust. When kings betrayed their own, loyalty crumbled. Subjects looked to the throne with suspicion. Communities fractured, fearing betrayal from neighbors as much as from enemies. Once, an oath sworn before ancestors carried weight. Now, promises could be bartered for muskets and rum. What is a crown worth when the people beneath it no longer believe in its justice? The third cost was strength. Armies armed with European guns seemed invincible in the moment. But when the trade collapsed centuries later, many kingdoms found themselves weakened, depopulated, unable to stand against new invaders. Betrayal had bought temporary power at the price of long-term ruin, and the final cost was memory. For generations, descendants carried the knowledge that their ancestors were betrayed, not only by strangers across the sea, but by rulers crowned in their own homeland. This wound, deeper than chains, was the silence of trust broken from within. History's irony is cruel. Kings sought immortality through gold and glory, but their legacy is remembered not for palaces, but for betrayal. The gold is gone. The names of many rulers are forgotten. What remains is the shadow of their choices and the scars borne by their people. The cost of betrayal was not counted in coins, but in bloodlines, in dignity, in futures that might have been. History may dwell on betrayal, but it also preserves the memory of those who stood firm in truth. Their victories were not measured in empires, but in conscience, a wealth that gold could never buy. The story of Futa Toro still resonates. When its leaders refused to sell their subjects, they declared before the world that justice was greater than profit. Their decision could not halt the slave trade, but it planted a principle in history, that righteousness has a voice even when surrounded by greed. The defiance of Queen Nzinga of Ndongo and Matamba echoes too. She played the game of diplomacy with Portuguese traders, not to betray her people, but to protect them. She forged alliances, waged wars, and even used cunning deception to preserve freedom in her land. Though her kingdom did not escape the tide forever, her name endures as a symbol of resistance, proof that not all rulers bent their crowns to chains. Even in silence, justice lived. Communities that fled inland rather than submit, captives who rose in rebellion within the dungeons of forts, prophets who condemned betrayal as an affront to the ancestors. These acts may not have toppled thrones, but they preserved honor. They kept alive the truth that Africa was never only a victim, never only betrayed, but always also resisting. And today, remembering them is an act of justice. For centuries, colonial narratives tried to paint Africa only in shadows, as complicit, as powerless, as forgotten. But to recall the righteous few is to reclaim truth, that betrayal did not define the whole, and that courage, though sometimes crushed, never disappeared. Justice remembered does not erase the wounds, but it ensures that the legacy of dignity shines brighter than the gold of betrayal. The story of betrayal and righteousness is not just the past, it is a mirror. The choices of kings who sold their people for gold remind us how power, when corrupted by greed, can destroy the very foundations it was meant to protect. The courage of those who resisted reminds us that truth and justice endure, even when drowned out by the roar of commerce and war. Today, the scars of slavery remain. Diasporas across the world carry with them the memory of chains, and within Africa, the silence of betrayal still lingers. To speak these truths is not to reopen wounds, but to honor them. It is to say that history belongs not only to the betrayers, but to the betrayed, and especially to the righteous few who stood against the tide. In our own time, the lesson is clear. Gold still glitters, power still tempts, and betrayal often dresses itself in the language of necessity or progress. But history teaches us that wealth without justice rots, and power without truth collapses. The kingdoms that traded dignity for profit are remembered not for their splendor, but for their fall. And yet, empathy has its own power. When we tell these stories through the voice of justice, we stand with those who suffered, and we honor those who resisted. We remind ourselves, and our audience, that history is not only about thrones and empires, it is about people whose worth could never truly be measured in gold. Forgotten history is not forgotten justice. By remembering, we restore dignity to the past, and by reflecting, we anchor righteousness in the present. Because to know these stories is not only to understand what happened, it is to choose which side of history we will stand on today.